Hrs GMT on Monday the 17th of March 2014. This is the first look at the BBC's coverage of Fleet Str's initial reports after Tony Benn's passing was announced. I shall be commenting further on this in due course.
Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what tomorrow's papers are bringing us. With me, our broadcaster Alice Arnold and Alison Phillips, the weekend editor at The Mirror. Let's look at those front pages then, and we'll begin with The Independent. It's featuring Tony Benn on its front page, and the headline is Death of a Maverick. The Daily Mirror features the missing plane as its main story. It speculates that hijackers flew the plane towards a remote island. The Daily Express version of the same story has the headline Pirates stole missing plane. The Daily Mail leads with a story about GM crops. Its headline, Scientists' Hidden Links to the GM food giants. The Eye reports that the Chancellor is set to reject big tax cuts for middle earners in the upcoming budget. The Times has a different take on the story. It says the so-called squeezed middle will be offered a tax reprieve in the next manifesto. The Daily Telegraph reports that non-Europeans can buy EU citizenship, entitling them to live and work in Britain. And The Guardian has a picture of Tony Benn as well, but its main story concerns that the cooperative is in a shambolic state. So let's begin, and we'll start with, of course, the death of Tony Benn, and there have been tributes paid widely to him by many politicians, of course. A sad day for lots of people at the Houses of Parliament today. And Alison, he was a divisive figure, but one respected because of his convictions, because of his passion.
Yeah, hugely divisive. I think as the all the tributes that we've had today have shown, in that on the one side we've got people saying that he was one of the most extraordinary politicians that we've seen, and that he wasn't scared to take on the most difficult of issues. But on the other side, you've got a lot of people, particularly sort of from the Labour ranks, who are saying he caused untold damage to the party at that point, and it made them virtually unelectable at one point, and that he caused a lot of division. So it's all sort of come together, but it has been a fascinating, but across the board there's been a huge affection for him as a man, and for somebody who did follow his principles and follow his convictions.
And his dedication to recording what was happening in politics throughout his 50-odd years,
Yes,
is extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, he was hugely admired whether you agreed with him or not, and I think that's and also by young people, which I think is quite interesting.
Yes.
I think young people really in
Yes.
the last 10 years or so really attached themselves to Tony Benn. Perhaps people who are younger than the generation that saw the damage possibly that he did. He then became this sort of principled old gentleman that
And they
people
could understand what he was saying.
Well, because he spoke so well and he spoke so clearly, and as Alison said earlier, you know, it wasn't full of political rhetoric and trying to please the party, and you know, you could tell that it's all been written by ad men. He didn't speak like that. He spoke clearly and from his heart.
That's it, because I suppose for a lot of young people, that generation who have grown up only really seeing politicians who just say what they think is the political answer to any question without ever coming out with any gut feeling or appearing to have any really strongly held convictions. That's, I think, his passion. I mean, the thing about the diaries is amazing as well. I mean, and tomorrow in the Mirror we've sort of done excerpts from like 7 diaries. But I went to his flat last year when I interviewed him, and he had these amazing volumes. And because first of all he spoke it onto a tape recorder, which was then transcribed into the diaries, and it was quite a laborious process. And every day, whatever he'd done, he would come home in the evening and then record the events of the day.
And inside the Mirror, you've got a piece by Paul Routledge. He was born into the establishment, yet became the nation's favourite revolutionary, refusing to sit, not wanting to sit in the House of Lords, wanting to become an MP,
Well, that's
giving
right.
up his title. The opposite of what we hear from a lot of Labour politicians who sort of criticise the House of Lords, but they're very glad to take a peerage in his office.
Yes, he was the opposite of that. I mean, he couldn't do anything about his background, so he had to get rid of his title. He had a big legal battle to get rid of his title so that he could sit in the House of Commons. Whereas most socialists have always, struggled. I struggled all my life and was brought up in a council flat. He could never claim that, and yet his cause was for the workers, and he was a true socialist, despite coming from the background that he did. Which makes him more interesting in a way.
Most people sort of mellow with older age, don't they? And they become sort of less radical, but he went in the other direction.
There's a great line that Routledge uses in this piece where he says it was on a political odyssey to the left, which continued to the end. And I think it absolutely did, really, and that he still remained very active, and he was still sort of going to Glastonbury and things like that and addressing loads of young people, which was
as
amazing.
he moved to the left, the Labour Party moved to the right, so that's probably seemed even more extreme than he would have done when the trade unions and things had more impact.
A lot of tributes, iconic, which can carry several meanings, can't it? But a lot of criticism as well today, which is odd, really, on the day that someone actually dies. But I don't suppose he'd have minded.
No, I think he would have expected criticism. He, encouraged criticism, let's say. He would have enjoyed that. He would have hated it if everyone had just said, we've all agreed with everything. He said, clearly, lots of people didn't. And he had terrible rows with people and terrible fights with people. But I think everyone sort of agrees that underneath that he was a gentleman.
Yeah, and apparently one of the last things he said was, I hope I never offended anyone. They probably offended him too, so we're even. Let's move on to the Daily Mail. Scientists' hidden links to the GM food giants. Disturbing truth by an official report that said the UK should forge on with Frankenfoods. This report was featured this morning in The Independent, saying that there's no scientific evidence to suggest that these foods will be damaging to human health or to the environment. The Daily Mail's been digging around, Alice, and saying that the authors of this report are connected to the companies which would be providing GM food products.
Well, that's right, and I think we all expect that academics are neutral. And I think what this points up is that academics are far from neutral most of the time. Now, the academics are all claiming that they are neutral, but if you look at the story, most of them who were involved in this report are funded, or their departments, maybe they're not directly funded, but their departments are funded by various groups who either make GM crops or encourage the use of GM crops. And so the claim is that this report cannot be independent because these scientists that are involved in the report are somewhat supported by the GM food industry.
But it's the EU that said there's to be no GM, so we couldn't go our own way anyway, could we?
Well, no, but I mean, I do think it leads to this sort of slightly wider point as to who are these experts that are helping shape policy, both in food and in all sorts of other areas. I mean, you can argue, obviously, that scientists need to be funded by someone, unless we're going to be entirely state-funded, which would be probably phenomenally expensive and not possible, and therefore people have got a vested interest in that field are going to be the ones that stump up the cash. But then we get to problems like this again, which we have had several times before, as to who's actually paying the piper.
Let's move on to the FT, and this is Michael Gove's